Howdy, I'm Kate Kavanaugh, and you're listening to the Mind, Body, and Soil podcast, where we're laying the groundwork for our land, ourselves, and for generations to come by looking at the way every thread of life is connected to one another. Communities above ground mirror the communities below the soil, which mirror the vast community of the cosmos. As the saying goes, as above, so below. Join me as we take a curious journey into agriculture, biology, history, spirituality, health, and so much more. I can't wait to unearth all of these incredible topics alongside you. Hello, and welcome to the Mind, Body, and Soil podcast. I am your host, Kate Kavanaugh, and it is always a pleasure to be here with you. One of the things that has been on my mind a lot lately is how we try to make really large numbers and ideas within what has become a really big world a little bit more accessible. And I've been thinking about the sort of double-edged sword that even as we can provide sort of anecdotes or analogies or these more tangible examples of big numbers, like for example, when you're talking about topsoil erosion and you try to quantify that in terms of how many pickup trucks and how many of those trucks would wrap around the world in an attempt for us to better visualize some of these big numbers. And this is going to actually happen quite a bit upcoming on the podcast, both in this episode and in future episodes. And I'm so fascinated by it because I think that at once when I say that the amount of the mileage of roads in the U.S. Forest Service is enough to cover all the way to the moon and almost back, I think that it gives you an idea of the largesse in a way that feels slightly more tangible, but in truth isn't any more tangible. And I'm just fascinated by kind of beginning to walk this line of illuminating big numbers that I think are thrown at us all the time. And my guest today, Robby Sansom, does an incredible job of exploring this topic with me. This episode is a fun one. It is definitely... we get into the really fine and granular details of running meat businesses. And so this is definitely a podcast for those in the industry and consumers that are interested in the inner workings of the meat industry and really diving into some of these numbers, which I loved. I hadn't done an episode quite like this in a while. And it was really fantastic to host Robby, who has become a friend over the years of visiting with him at Rome Ranch in Fredericksburg, Texas, which is a great time to mention that I will be back in Fredericksburg for the What Good Shall I Do conference, which is put on by Force of Nature, where Robby is the CEO. And it is going to be fantastic. So the conference is April 19th and 20th with an optional field day on the 21st. It is going to be full of some really powerful speakers and panels and workshops, including past guests on this podcast. And I think I'm honored to call them both friends, Fred Provenza and Bill Schindler, whose episodes you can find in our backlog. They're fantastic. And I will be there with other incredible humans and talking about what it means to take action. This is a conference that is really going to be oriented around strategies and tools to drive change across the land, both on the land itself and within ourselves. And I think that those two things are very intricately linked. And I think that this is a fantastic opportunity. And having visited the Rome Ranch a couple of times in the past few years, and I spoke at last year's conference and will be on a small panel this year. And I just think that the work that they're doing and the way that they showcase and articulate that work is really unparalleled. And this is a really special opportunity to connect in person and to really connect into a landscape and to take those ideas home. The talk that I gave at last year's conference is also on this podcast, as well as on the Force of Nature podcast, Where Hope Grows. And I just think this is a fantastic opportunity. So snag your tickets today for April 19th and 20th in Fredericksburg, Texas, for the What Good Shall I Do conference put on by Force of Nature. Couple of little updates. I know it's been a second since I posted an episode. I have a big old backlog of guests. And so we are going to be diving into some really deep episodes and kind of taking a little bit of a pivot and exploring some about infrastructure and about supply chains outside of the food system and looking at resources beyond that of food that help us move food from place to place. And so expect some pretty wild episodes coming up that I am just super excited about and can't wait to share with you. So if you want to be at the top of the list for those, hit that little follow or subscribe button wherever you listen to podcasts. If you enjoy this episode, one of the easiest ways for this podcast to grow is if you share it with a friend. More than 50% of all podcasts are found by word of mouth and by being shared with others. And if you would if you leave a written review on Apple Podcasts and shoot me a little snapshot on Instagram, I'm happy to send you a little snail mail thank you note. I am so appreciative of everyone that keeps showing up for these episodes and just delighted to bring you this conversation with my friend Robby, who I just think is fantastic at articulating some of these concepts. And we really dive into something I think is important, which is how we find both environmental and financial sustainability within the scope of perishable meat products. And this is something that I have a lot of experience with, as I have owned and operated Western Daughters Butcher Shop in Denver, Colorado for the last decade and have hung on by the skin of our teeth in that business because it is incredibly tight margined. But it is vital that we find a way to create sustainability within these food businesses. And I'm excited to get a chance to muse on what that means with my friend Robby. And so here is our conversation. To porcupine, which that was new.
Wait, so how did the tracking begin?
The tracking began because I came across the porcupine's tracks, but couldn't tell exactly what it was. It was a very light dusting of snow, and so I felt compelled to follow it until I got a good print and could better identify what it was.
I just saw it. Hold on. Darn it, that was going to be fast because I saw it. Oh, there it is. Have you ever read this book?
Is this a porcupine? No.
Is that in reverse?
I haven't.
Does that look like you're reading it?
The Tracker. Yeah. No. The Tracker. Tom Brown Jr.
Such a fun book. About a guy, I think in the Northeast, that grew up kind of in a rural area and befriended a neighbor who was a Native American tracker and had a grandson. And him and the grandson were the same age, and he basically got to grow up learning the ways of tracking from an actual legitimate tracker that was in the Native American. I think you would love it. I think you would really love that book.
Yeah.
It's a very fun book.
Yeah, that sounds incredible. Where did you grow up? I don't know the answer to this question. This wasn't on my list.
Here, Austin.
You grew up in Austin. Did you grow up spending a lot of time outside?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, oh yeah. Yeah. Austin's well known for its green spaces. So, there's the green belt that runs through Austin, which is kind of like a Central Park, if you will. And my neighborhood was adjacent to that. So I grew up running around in there. And then my father's side of the family is from this area and actually grew up in a farming community just west of Austin called Johnson City. My great-grandfather was the sheriff there and had whatever it was, 15 kids. And and they all ended up with ranches. And so we grew up getting to go out there and, live in the city, but get to experience some of that lifestyle. And then I always loved hunting and fishing and would go to the coast and fish in the inland bays and I was pretty much outside, mom, summertime, tell me not to come home until dark sort of deal.
Yep. Yep. I feel like we might have hit the last generation that really had that full experience of not coming home until dark. Just I used to ride my bike, but for hours and hours, just finding different things outdoors.
Yeah, I had to argue with my daughter's daycare because they require us to deliver our children lathered in sunscreen upon arrival every
Oh,
single day. And then they want to
what?
reapply at noon. And I was like, well, how about we're not going to be doing that? And,
Absolutely not.
I was like, I've never in my entire life got a sunburn at school. Like, what are you doing? You have shaded playgrounds under oak canopies and you're in a classroom and you may see some, like, anyway, you and I are probably in similar lines of thinking around
We are.
applications of sunscreen, but
We
it's
are.
like, yeah, like we'll probably get into the whole synthetic world thing, but the idea that we have to fear the sun is one of those, maybe one more of those
Mm,
examples of how we've lost touch with reality.
hmm.
Or same vein,
Deeply.
child, have a baby, trying to figure out this whole parenting thing, go to the pediatrician, and they're like, hey, it's really important that for the first 6 months you don't expose your baby to the sun. It could be really harmful to them. Also, you need because it doesn't convey through breast milk very well. You need to supplement her diet with vitamin
Mm,
D3.
hmm. As if there might not be a reason in that body why vitamin D3 isn't present,
I'm
which
like,
is something that I've always considered.
I'm just like,
Maybe there's a reason it's not
you
there.
hear yourself saying these things? Does this not sound like a contradiction? It's as obvious to me as it is to you. Anyway,
Hmm.
we are going to try to keep this as to condense. We're not doing.
I so I asked you where you grew up for a specific reason. So you and I have and the listeners might not know this. You and I have gotten to know one another a little bit over the last year, which has actually been a real joy. I've really enjoyed getting to know you through repeated visits to Rome Ranch and chats on the phone and just talking to you. And I've been really struck by, with you in particular, that you have a real gift for blending together the qualitative and the quantitative. And in spending time with you in person, in particular, you have a deep sense of presence and ability to be with where you are and who you are with that I am really struck by. You just are there when you are having a conversation with you. You are 100% in that conversation. And when you are out in a field with some bison talking about the land, you are together and with that land in a way that really holds that presence. And I was really struck by this when I initially met you and we began talking, and this sort of deep understanding that you emanate of what I'm going to call the natural world. And at that same time, with that presence and that connection that you have with this complex entity that is the ecosystems that we find ourselves in, the relationships that we find ourselves in, both human and human to land stewardship. You also have a foot in the door in the quantitative world. You have a master's in finance, and you and I have spent a lot of time talking about numbers, both real and quite abstract, and trying to get a handle on some of these big numbers and what they might mean in business and ecosystems, sort of writ large in a universe sort of way. And so I'm really interested in your ability to connect these two dots and these two worlds, because I really feel like we find ourselves in a space where we've come to realize our separation from nature, and we are seeking it out to begin to hold that presence again. But at the same time, we find ourselves in a world that has a lot of quantitative analysis that needs to be done. And I think sometimes these two spaces are a little bit at odds, and at other times they're kind of a Venn diagram where they're meeting in the middle. And there's kind of these different ways that I think the quantitative and the qualitative in today's world interact. And I kind of think you're the perfect person to interact with them.
Well, thank you. I take all of that as a compliment.
It is,
which I struggle to take in general, but I think it's probably just because I think the more you learn, and I'm extremely curious, the more you realize you don't know a damn thing. So it's hard to be put forward as a competent source, or let alone expert on anything, when I feel like I know very little and learn from experts. And yeah, I think like humans are fascinating creatures. The way that we adapt, the way our brain works to take very confusing information and over time learn how to parse out patterns that make it tangible and relatable for us. The way we see, the way we think. That's how illusions work, and things like that. And I feel like, you had sent me an article on hyperobjects. That comes to mind here, or like the Dunning-Kruger effect, where people are so overconfident that they understand something, that the level of hubris is remarkable because of how ignorant we truly are, and so many things we express such confidence about. And the hyperobject thing, where these concepts are so grand that all of the shortcuts that we make to try to comprehend the world break under the pressure and weight of the idea of a black hole, or the idea of the infinite universe, or the idea of what I sent you on 52 factorial, and these things. And I think when we talk about some of the other things, I'm curious about everything, but when you get into things that I'm passionate about, in this case agriculture and our food system, and you start trying to relate these concepts, with force of nature, we always talk about trying to create awareness, and then, access. The awareness part's really difficult. It's difficult to reach people with a story they want to listen to. But when you're really trying to give them a call to action, to be a catalyst for change, you don't have to inspire them in and of itself. You have to give them an appreciation for the opportunity. And part of that is a juxtaposition between what they think is reality and what the truth is. And some of these concepts are so big. When we talk about erosion, we talk about, the existence of an Anthropocene extinction, and all these global crises, pollinators and toxins in food, and fertility, and population growth, or is it population decline? Depends on what angle you want to look at. And then you recognize that for maybe it's a survival mechanism, maybe it's energy conservation, but reductionism seems to prevail today, especially in the information age. And so now you got to take very complex, difficult to grasp or wrangle ideas and try to synthesize them in a way that makes them quickly relatable and comprehensible to a population that unknowingly or unintentionally celebrates reductionism, which is probably counter to that effort. And that's really a long way of saying I try myself to understand what the heck these massive numbers mean. And then I really try to figure out how to make it relatable for other folks to understand, so that they can, be better informed when they make choices. It's not my job to tell them what choice to make, but I really want to help them understand the world around them so they can make the best choice for themselves. And this seems to be a way to connect those dots.
I love that. And I think connecting the dots of what is a very complex system, whether that's our food system or an ecosystem, whatever that is, these are very complex ideas. And I think that as I've spent more time with you and with Force of Nature, I have seen just how much effort and investment you have put forward into helping to distill these concepts. And I think we have a lot working against us in that, we have these phones that create a very short attention span and attempt to distill concepts into 60 and 90 second little bites. And when we're talking about the complexities of a food system, an economic system, an ecosystem, it's very hard to distill. But I think that one thing that Force of Nature has really done is to distill it into story. And I think story is how we as humans better understand things, not just this deluge of facts or of numbers that are so big that they are kind of outside of our imagination. And you brought in this idea of we're dealing with a lot of hyper objects. And this has come up in several different podcasts, but a hyperobject is an object or event whose dimensions in space and time are massive in relation to human life. This is the work of Timothy Morton and describes, all the plastic that we've created in this world, or the amount of concrete that we have, which is 30 billion tons a year is how much concrete we produce, or how much topsoil we've lost in the Midwest since we began farming it, which is over 50 billion tons. These are numbers and stories that are difficult to convey. And I think that at Force of Nature, you're really putting a lot of time and investment into helping understand both a regenerative system and some of the externalities that surround it as well.
You're exciting because I want to start diving into those big numbers, but I love the concept of hyperobject. And there was another definition in that article I want to share as well, and it was that these objects threaten our survival in ways that defy traditional modes of thinking about reality and humiliate our cognitive powers, a disorienting shift that sends many people reeling into superstition, polarization, and denial. And that's why I say it's like maybe the way this reductionism is a survival mechanism, because these numbers are big and scary and again, humiliate our ability to understand. And, I think you just like look at the idea of money and economics that affects us, right? Like the US government makes a little over $6 trillion a year, or a little over $4 trillion a year, and spends a little over $6 trillion. So we two and change $1 trillion deficit every year. It's not that big. We have $200 trillion in deficit, unfunded liabilities, I should say.
I pulled these numbers up too. We were right there.
those are big numbers. And I think it's so big. It's easy just to the news shows it and people don't even have an emotional reaction. Well, it's because we don't know how big a trillion is.
You can't.
A million, let's do this little fun one. So a million seconds ago was 11 days ago. A billion seconds ago was 1992. A trillion seconds ago was 31,000 BC.
Oh.
So we throw these big numbers around, and I think to conceptualize them is scary and challenging, but I think necessary and important for us to appreciate the gravity and the potential, the gravity of risks and the potential of opportunities. I'd love to dive into the topsoil thing you threw out there too, because 50 billion tons of topsoil, pretty big number.
Just in the Midwest.
Yeah, just in the Midwest, and
that's not the world.
Well, I think you hear the, it's often maybe somewhat misrepresented, but I don't think it should take away from the sentiment behind the statement. A representative from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations said 3 or 4 years ago that there was maybe 60 harvests left, meaning 60 years of productivity in the agriculture systems around the globe that we'll be able to continue to produce food. And that statement was made specific to rates of loss of topsoil globally. Meaning we're losing topsoil, this non-renewable, finite resource that all life terrestrially depends on, at such a rate that 1 generation from now, we won't be able to produce food. And so that's
non-renewable. Can I pick at that a little bit? What do you think about that?
I think it's considered a non-renewable resource because in nature, it takes over 500 years to create an inch of topsoil. And as you noted, we're losing it at a rate that far exceeds that. I also think it's a misrepresentation because we see regenerative systems producing topsoil that far exceeds the natural rate of topsoil production and does demonstrate that it can be renewed. I don't think that is I don't think that's a convenient reality for the folks that, want to, that have incentives that say that we need to use human ingenuity to invent synthetic alternatives to natural systems.
Fascinating. Yes, I agree with that. Thank you. Okay, you can keep going. I just wanted to make sure we teased that out.
Yeah, well, yeah, you and I would say it's renewable, but I would think it nonetheless it's considered non-renewable. And it's curious because you had mentioned 50 billion tons of topsoil lost in the West alone and U.S. alone. Like as of like 2014, we succeeded in getting our rate of topsoil loss down to only along the lines of 2 billion tons per year in the U.S. Nonetheless, that makes topsoil our number one export. The EPA says it's the number one source of water pollution. All these other things. So how much is 2 billion tons? A pickup truck carries 2 cubic yards, which is about 2 tons. An average pickup truck is 19.8 feet long. There's 5,280 feet in a mile. There is about 24,901 miles around the globe by way of the equator. So if you do the math, it takes 1 billion trucks lined up in a row, and that effectively amounts to a row of trucks wrapping the equator 150 times full of topsoil to represent 1 year of topsoil loss in the United States. Of a resource that should be renewable, but isn't celebrated as such because only 1% of our agriculture systems are demonstrating a capacity to renew it. And we are losing it at a rate, again, according to the FAO and all science, faster than it is created. And we will not be able to produce food if this continues, which is why we have to regenerate those ecosystems in that soil base and so on. But that's just like one number that is so unappreciated and thrown out. But that presents an existential risk to the human species within our lifetimes, potentially, if not addressed. But again, it's a hyper object, so kind of just cast it aside and treat it like that quote said, superstition, polarization, and denial, because it's scary large.
Yeah, it's overwhelming. And this is something I want to point out. Like you hear that at 150 some times that this line of trucks wraps around the earth full of topsoil just for the United States. That's so overwhelming that it is easy for us to dismiss. And this was what I call back of the napkin math that you and I did sitting together at the Force of Nature, What Good Shall I Do conference, as we were kind of thinking about how to express this. And one of the things that keeps coming up in interviews is we can't, sort of the idea of shifting baselines, right? That we can't want to preserve or save or invest in what we don't know or understand. And I think when we make some of these numbers that are in essence imaginary a little bit more real, it helps us understand the gravity. And the trick is not to get lost in it. And to have, I think, even an anchor point within a story that we are beginning to craft as a community, as different ecosystems, about how we might move forward from these unimaginably large numbers.
Well, and I think there's two sides to the coin. I think some of them often are framed in ways that are scary. Like I just said, it was an existential threat to the human species, and there's all these global crises that are a threat to the environment, the planet, and so many other things. And that's scary. So it's easy to want to distract yourself in something else and not have to face the severity or the weight of that. But the other side of the coin is the reason that the impact and the scale of these issues are so grand is because the scale of the things that we're doing to cause them are so grand. And seemingly in some cases, subtle changes at that same scale can produce equally profound yet positive benefits,
Hmm.
or corrections or mitigations or recovery. So it's like, as much as we may have fear for the concern, there should be hope for the opportunity at that same scale. And I think that's the key takeaway, is not to be intimidated, and return your head into the sand once faced with these realities and appreciation of the challenge, but to say, okay, that's a tough one. I'm going to swallow that pill, but you know what? I'm going to dust myself off, and I'm going to start doing something about it, and try to take the power and the potential of these systems to do harm, and transition it and help it evolve into a mission and a potential for good.
You said at the beginning of this that there was a gravity of risk, and the other side of that coin is a potential of opportunity. And I think that that was a really beautiful distillation of that. It is both, and I think that oftentimes we are at our sometimes we're at our best as a community in striving towards ingenuity when our backs are a little bit against the wall.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think that's one of the superpowers of humans, is that human ingenuity, and that capacity to react, respond, manipulate, improve, and
Mm.
understand our circumstances better than any other species on the planet. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe we're wrong about that. Maybe, to our own peril. And I think that's the other interesting thing about human ingenuity. Since you brought it up, is I think we once again have a hubris about its potential. We truly believe we can invent our way out of any problem. And
Mhm.
I think we hyper focus on one element, and we lose track of the infinite, unintended consequences of things that we do. It's like the butterfly effect. We
Yes.
invent one thing and we think, aha, I went to solve for this one thing and I did it, you see? And it's as if the
Mm.
billion unintended consequences as a result of that, don't matter. Or that
Mm.
they matter, but we're not even aware of them. So we don't have to address it. So I
Mm.
think human ingenuity is incredible. I think it's important, and the idea of rewilding, or the idea when I'm faced with somebody, we're talking about agriculture and regenerative agriculture, like, oh, it's just like, you mean like doing it the way we used to do it? I'm like, no, well, we need human ingenuity here. There are
Mhm.
things that are permanently and forever changed and disrupted, and we understand more about we don't understand everything, but we understand more about systems and interrelation and environment. We have to be able to celebrate that. But I think we have to do it with some humility and some, much greater respect for the billions of years of evolution that got us here, and the potential and power of nature, and maybe a little more fear and a little more awe and a little more caution, um, when we apply it.
As you were talking, I was thinking about how much reductionism has happened as we have become increasingly more quantitative in our prowess, as we have been able to compute bigger numbers, both with the help of computers and with certain aspects of physics and mathematics that have come in. And I think that oftentimes our hubris comes in the reduction of turning everything into an equation without really understanding the qualitative aspects of a system. An ecosystem is so incredibly and beautifully complex that it cannot be reduced into some of these single solutions that I think that we are imagining in these sort of techno utopias where we synthesize all of our food, as opposed to looking for, and I'm going to be very tongue in cheek here, the force of nature that we can find a lot of these collaborative constellations of, if not solutions, then working within the framework of nature to develop some new tools. And just like you said, it's not going back to how we used to do it. There is some ingenuity here, but there is also a respect and a collaboration that is happening within an ecosystem and us.
Yeah, I mean, ecosystem function and harmony depends on diversity. We celebrate that in so many ways. These challenges that we're facing will require a diversity of solutions, um, and innovation and ingenuity and all the things. Um, and then we get into, and yet we still find ourselves often in these dogmatic camps,
Mhm.
or maybe we over anchor with and some level of hubris to one path, or solution, when we should be
Mm.
at least curious and open to the idea that there are probably maybe many other alternatives, that are necessary or even complementary. And
Do you feel like we've covered numbers? I have a question bubbling up, but I want to make sure that we've covered numbers because I certainly have more numbers here for
no,
us
we've
to
not
kind of
even
dive into.
scratched the surface
We haven't
on
even touched
numbers,
it.
but
Okay,
we
good.
don't have to
Good.
stay there. There's so much else to cover. The one thing I was going to say, though, on your point about qualitative versus quantitative, is I think, and reductionism is, you're like, you noted that sometimes we don't understand the qualitative aspects, of or the qualitative or the quantitative aspects of qualitative things. And I was like, I don't think we understand the quantitative aspects of quantitative things. And
I
so
agree.
often statistics are used to mislead or misguide or deceive. And in the reductionist world, it's really a really convenient path to, um, advancing an agenda, even at the expense of the people that are doing the legwork. And so I think that's the other part
Mm.
of data is
Hmm.
trying to break through some of the, conditioning and, um, you know framing and, you know belief system, nurturing that have been ingrained into the ideas and thinking of people that are leveraged and used against them.
Mm.
Percentages and multiple. It gets really, really
Yeah.
confusing. And so I think trying to take complex things and simplify it in a way that's honest and, authentic and transparent, in the best interest of people. And again, not, like, I definitely am not objective. I definitely have my own agendas and beliefs, but I try as well as I can, um, to be objective and to try to represent in fair ways, um, those truths as well. Because I mean, I think we all have seen all the fun ways that statistics can, be deceiving.
Yes, and be leveraged against us. And I think that is, and I think we swim in a lot of statistics. They are thrown our way in regards to everything. They are often not looked at very closely or in consideration of all the multifactorial variables that go into them. Right, that they are reduction is at its finest. That what goes into them is not the constellation of things that truly does go into them, and I think that's where things get pretty tricky.
Yeah, I mean, life is hard. Most people are struggling, and
Mm.
in some ways, that's just a
Mhm.
human thing. We manage to fit that into whatever our reality is. And it is, to your point, dizzying, all that is thrown at
Mm.
us. And when
Yeah.
our when our struggle with trying to navigate through all of it causes us to seek the path of least resistance, that is what's leveraged against us. And what pisses me off is when it does come at the expense of our own well-being and intention. When you take a well-meaning person, confuse them, and trick them against their own desires to take intentional, thoughtful action down a path that is actually contradictory to their effort. And that happens every day across industries. And I think it's despicable. And it,
Mm.
like I said, it angers me into wanting to take some of that on. Um, but it's a big job.
Tell me what you mean about take some of that on. Take some of that on as a business, take some of that on at a personal level, at an information level?
I just want to empower consumers. I believe in a consumer revolution. I believe, a bunch of farmers can stand up against the most powerful nation in the world and free themselves from, you know, like in the American Revolution we did against, the British because of treatment. I believe that people can rise up together, and I think we see this time and again through history. And I think we're in many respects in need of a sort of awakening from consumers. The system is off the tracks in many ways. Our political system isn't representing the best interest of the people that elect the system, our food system, our healthcare system. Um, there's so many different areas in which I think everything that we've been discussing manifests into a reality that we are cogs in a machine, again, counter to our knowledge or intention, that is operating against our interests. And so when I say take it on, I mean, to whatever extent I can as an individual, we can as a company, we can as a movement, empower people with knowledge that they can do with as they please. Do what's right for you, make choices, decisions, priorities that are appropriate based on your values, your situation, etc. But in a world where you're being misled, mistreated, intentionally confused and used, your positive intentions generate negative outcomes. I want to see your positive intentions generate positive outcomes. And I think that comes through awareness and education. That's why I always say, like, awareness to these issues and then access to a system that allows you to choose an alternate path if it is the one that suits you or the one that you agree is a better alternative.
Mm. I think I want this to lead into, I want to talk about what it means to build a business around some of these ideas, to build a business around the ideas of creating consumer awareness, of telling stories about land and about food systems, about making transparent some of these really deep systems. I'm gonna read Force of Nature's mission statement, and we're gonna kind of go from there. Does that sound all right?
Yeah, I'd rather you read it. You have a way with reading.
Okay. So we spent the last decade studying regenerative agriculture at ranches all over the world before we answered the community's call to launch Force of Nature. Never before has a company founded on the principles of regenerative agriculture curated a vast collection of land stewards, ranchers, and farmers who are committed to creating a positive return on the planet. Our mission is to accelerate the creation of a global regenerative supply network, to justify our suppliers' partners' efforts on the land, and to offer consumers the awareness and the ability to vote for a system that aligns with their values. By reclaiming the legacy of meat, we will benefit all stakeholders of the planet and restore regenerative principles to their rightful place as the keystone to our agricultural system. I think it's interesting that already so much of what we've touched on is touched on here in this mission statement. And I think that something I'm really interested in beginning to discuss is how we build a regenerative business here in a moment in time where what our friend Anthony Gustin calls the corporate organism has, which I love, has sort of captured the idea of quantitative bottom lines as their bottom line, and to return to an idea of soil as a bottom line, and to create communities as a bottom line, and to create this global network where you are, and again, we're talking about accelerating the regeneration of topsoil, where you are supporting those efforts by creating these communities. These are not the foundations that we build a lot of businesses on these days.
I love I think most things that I do or write or am a part of, I always want to tweak and edit. But man, I love love that mission statement, and it still holds true years later. And I appreciate you noting the consistency with which many of those are core and foundational to, how we think about life and business as well. Part of your question, makes me think about a couple of things. One is, the corporate organism, or the psychopathy represented by purely profit-driven corporations, and then the other is, an alternative, for like a triple bottom line company, a company that success is defined on a set of pillars. It's not just profit, but also people and also planet. 3 legs of a stool that make the whole more appropriate and successful and usable. You take away one leg, or you take away 2 legs, and you're on a pretty unstable foundation. And it's going back to that idea of diversity. It's like, I think for a business to be profitable is necessary. If you are not profitable, you do not exist.
Yeah.
That is the necessary component for financial sustainability. And in our case, we want to represent that there's an alternative to the broken food system that's spinning off externalities faster than we can track them, that create devastating consequences. There is an alternative, and that alternative is appealing from a financial perspective.
Yes.
It has to be a healthy alternative, but it also can't only be appealing on a financial perspective, because I think the pure pursuit of that is what's got us into this perspective. It also has to be healthy on how it impacts people and communities and social issues, their health, their self-worth, their experience, and the planet, including its animals and their welfare and those ecosystems and their health. And, all of those things, I think producing positive outcomes for people, in this case, if you're a company, like, how insane is it that don't you want to have positive experiences for your consumers and for your employees? Like, if you don't do that, how do you meet any definition of success?
Yes.
And how do you sleep if you're destroying the world around you at the same time? And that opportunity exists. It's not like there are massive compromises that must be made. It is just that we went really far down exclusively profit-focused path. The alternative path doesn't take away many of those same incentives. It just creates more abundance elsewhere. And that's where we say this is replacing a vicious system with a virtuous one. And I think the psychopathy thing, to be a psychopath, it's like you're emotionless. You can knowingly and intentionally cause harm and justify it when you're a business, because you have a fiduciary, a legal responsibility to maximize profit. So if you're on a board, or you're an executive or director for a large public company, it is a crime not to put that first. And, I think this idea that there's the quote, air quotes, that the man, or like they, or the cabal, or whoever else is, controlling things, particularly around big businesses, they don't exist. Those are large organizations of people like you and like I, that genuinely mean well. Generally, there may be some evil people out. Certainly, historically, we can say definitively there are evil people out there, but they are also the exception. And the humans that make up these organizations are no different. These organizations are responding to incentives, and they've gotten really fucking good at wiping everything off the table that gets in the way, and focusing on the incentives that maximize profit without concern for the consequences. Now, that's not to say there's not truly without concern, because the people do have concern, but then you get into groupthink, and you get into like this mass formation psychosis, and we can almost justify our way into any reality. And we've seen that through history as well, because humans are impressionable and persuadable, and so on and so forth. And there's a lot of money and a lot of power in these organizations. And I think, again, that's where it comes back to those incentives. And so I think, long way around, I think that's how businesses are producing. That's how they then have an incentive to put lobbyists, big food, big ag, big pharma, big chemical, big petroleum, control the news through advertising dollars, control Washington and bureaucrats through lobbying dollars, therefore control policy and control outcomes. And they've created a self-fulfilling, self-perpetuating reality that continues to maintain the status quo at the expense of all other shareholders, all other stakeholders on the planet, and the other aspects of what I would consider to be successful pillars of a balanced bottom line or a triple bottom line approach.
You and I initially began this conversation around regeneratives and sustainable business. I told you that one of the things that keeps me up at night, I think actually tomorrow is the 10th anniversary of Western Daughters being open.
Congratulations.
So we've hit this right at this time. And one of the things that I told you kept me awake at night was that I want to make sure that this business of regenerative agriculture is regenerative for every party in a way that is both environmentally and economically regenerative. And that my concern, having been in the meat business for the last almost 15 years, is that it's incredibly hard for the farmers and ranchers to make money. And in order to pay them well, which, I know Western Daughters does, and I know Force of Nature does too, makes it very hard for that business itself to make money. And that consumers are a part of this too, and having access to some of these nutrient-dense whole foods. And so the idea of building an economically sustainable business is especially vital when you consider that the corporate organism has become so beholden. And when I say corporate organism, one of the things that I like about it is it bypasses people, right? I no longer think that there's like this cabal of evil people that are trying to control that, but it's just been captured in something that has snowballed, this sort of beholden to the bottom line at the cost of all these other stakeholders within the system, at the cost of the planet, at the cost of people's health. At the cost of all of these different things that should be a part of this triple bottom line that you're talking about, where you have profit, you have people, and you have planet. And without any leg of that stool, the entire thing collapses. And so important to me, as I have considered how hard it has been to make Western Daughters work over the last decade, has been that we have to build something that is economically feasible within this industry for it to begin to regenerate and to accelerate the regeneration of topsoil and of human health, as we look at what $4.1 trillion that the United States spends on healthcare. Just to throw another unimaginable number in there. That we need these businesses to function. And I think that you and I have had a lot of good chats talking about how to make the whole nutrient dense foods that are perishable and that haven't been turned into a powder or a pill work as a business.
Yeah, and how do you do so walking the tightrope in a direction that continues to produce a net positive outcome for stakeholders? Because there's going to be trade-offs. It's like your doctor tells you your blood pressure's high, you need to exercise, so you go exercise. Now you have some time management issues and maybe a sore knee every now and again. So there's no perfect. It's not like pure utopia. Like there is going to be an ebb and a flow. And I think, some of what you and I have talked about, and, it's a fear of mine, is that, if Force of Nature succeeds at the expense, the ultimate and final expense of Western Daughters, like if our success is, it's a zero-sum game and I succeed at your expense, well, that to me, that's a failure. or if I succeed at the expense of the local farm in your area that you're sourcing from, that's a failure. Now, definitively, force of nature showing up as available in a Sprouts or a Whole Foods near where Western Daughters is located will unquestionably result in a consumer buying a force of nature product who may have otherwise bought a Western Daughters product. And so it's like, shit, like, okay, do we throw the baby out with the bathwater? Or does the inverse also hold true, and force of nature introduces somebody into this idea and this reality, and it generates incremental consumers, or that consumer buys a bison from force of nature and then goes to Western Daughters to buy beef? So it's complex, and it's like there will undoubtedly be trade-offs. And my hope and my intention is that those trade-offs produce a net positive. I do think going back to diversity of solutions, like we do need small scale solutions. We are a nation of farmers. We used to be overwhelmingly farmers. 2 centuries ago, we were 60%. A century ago, we were 30%. Now we're like 3% farmers. We've created a system where farmers are that we've created a system that is failing consumers and failing farmers. And we, probably get into agribusiness versus agriculture, but I want people who give a shit about the land and the community and me as a consumer they may never meet who will be eating their product. That's who I want producing my food, not one of these psychopathic organizations who doesn't give a shit about me or a damn about the things that I care about and is only trying to drive their bottom line. Like, that's a concern. I don't want to be complicit in advancing that reality. And so it's like the thing that keeps me up, and why we have those conversations where I'm like, what about this? What about that? But what I do know is, demand, meat consumption has generally gone down. We eat 87% of the red meat we did a generation ago. And that said, the consumption of grass-fed meat is growing at about 2.5 times a year. It's far exceeding the growth in demand for red meat. I also know that eating 87% of the red meat we did a generation ago is a large part of the reason that we're suffering many health consequences. I think red meat is a superfood. We need to eat more of it. It needs to be coming from these better systems. It needs to be a part of the solution. And so I know we're creating more. I know as a broad, we are creating more demand for grass-fed and regenerative. I know as a broad, the size of the pie grows, and it disproportionately doesn't take from force of nature or Western Daughters. Hopefully it takes from Tyson and Cargill. And then serves consumers in the process. Therefore, we are all beneficiaries of this mission, this revolution, and this evolution in food production.
I love you brought this up, and I kind of actually want to frame this a little bit for listeners, because you and I were on a call, and you asked me if I thought that force of nature was competition for Western Daughters, and I had to think about it for a minute, and then I actually ended up thinking about it quite a bit. And so I want to couch this from my perspective too, because when I thought about it, the answer was yes. I do think that force of nature is to some degree competition for Western Daughters in the immediate right now. And I think that the customer that force of nature is taking away from Western Daughters is the one that really values the convenience of a single source shopping trip. That here they have this great option for a regenerative grass-fed meat in their Whole Foods, their Safeway, their HEB, wherever that may be. And Western Daughters has always been a bit of a struggle because you have to make an extra stop, or you ship directly to their doorstep, and we don't do that. And so I think that is true, but I also am a really big believer in the idea that we are creating an ecosystem of businesses, and not unlike, the sort of understory of a forest, you are going to have these different niches that are filled within that ecosystem and are all equally critical. And so that's one part of it, right? Is the idea that we need local farms and ranches where people can shop down the street or make a 30-minute drive and pick up meat right from their local food system. We need Western Daughters, which is sort of bringing those rural those rural communities and that rural meat into an urban environment and kind of bridging that gap. And we need, and increasingly urban environments, we absolutely need convenient and regenerative meat solutions in every grocery store. And so I think you're sort of filling these different niches. But I also think, to go back to something that we talked about at the beginning, that force of nature has a big investment in telling the story and creating information about what regenerative, or even just looking at what grass-fed might mean to the consumer, and to look at some of that consumer recognition of those terms, where all of the sudden, again, and I'm going to come back to this from an earlier part of our conversation, where we're talking about what we don't know, what we don't see, we can't then become interested in investing in or preserving. And so when force of nature brings to the attention of the consumer that this is a whole category that exists, then that consumer suddenly knows about it and can seek it out across a variety of different businesses. And I think that right now there's this sort of tension between, you know, the very small and the smaller businesses. I don't know where you'd couch force of nature, and I'm not going to couch it for you, but there seems to be this tension, and I don't actually think that's necessary, and I've thought a lot about it. I think that this is a rising tide lifts all ships situation, and fills all niches, in which about 3/4 of our population is about to exist in an urban environment, and they need access to great meat too.
No, I appreciate that. I mean, I think you and I both have thought long and hard about it, and I think, I totally, like, there's this paradigm too. It's like, is the best way to source any item, and we're focusing on meat, but we should probably talk about international markets at large at some point, and what all is.
Yeah.
But is it like, where's the right line to draw, and or when you decide, is that arbitrary, or what is it based on? Should you only be supporting producers of products, in this case meat, that reside on your same street or in your same zip code? Or is it the city or the county? Is it the state and people in the other states don't deserve to be in your territory? Or is it the region or the country or the continent? How do you do the calculus on what is and is? And I think what we would agree is that it's going, and you said, with the global population being urban, not everybody is connected to a food producing community. No. Or a good producing community for a good they require, or a food producing community for the type of food that they desire,
Correct.
And so how do they, how do we each live our lives, and draw, I think it's for the individual, but I think you and I would agree that to the extent it's possible, you want to be working with and sourcing as close to your community as you can within reason. And you can define within reason even how you want, but means, knowledge, yes. Education, values.
Yes.
But there's a reason I take every opportunity I can to say, the best way to source meat is to do it yourself. Either start your own regenerative operation, or go hunt a wild animal and fail and struggle and suffer and bleed and sweat and cry, and have the deepest, strongest, most forged bond with that food, reverence, gratefulness for it, and an appreciation when you step out of that for the abundance that surrounds you. Then, if you can't do that, which the majority of the world can't and won't, then you should try to find somebody that's practicing a form of agriculture or form of production, again, whatever the good may be, that aligns with your values, who is as close to you as possible, that is a part of your community. They need you. They deserve you. Like in this case, this is where I would say Western Daughters comes into play. Like, don't buy a force of nature item if you have the opportunity to get that at Western Daughters. Like, that's what I would do. I go to a farmer's market to buy products that my company even sells, and I talk to the, like Orion from Terra Pureza here, who's in my area doing really cool things with anyway, it doesn't matter. Like I always try to defer to that. And some people throw that in my face, like, oh, well, you say that, but like nobody's going to really do that. And I'm just going to go buy your product. And it's like, I still mean it, and I still practice it myself. And I still believe that's the option that's available to most folks. But look, if a large number of people aren't that close, or for the challenge and difficulty of living and managing their own life,
yes,
do by a force of nature, don't follow that advice or heed that encouragement and go to force of nature, they're still supporting regenerative. And I don't feel bad about
and their health.
And I think
their health.
Yeah,
and I think there is
like, let's not leave the consumer out of this. You know what I mean? Like that choice may not be the best choice for the local purveyor, but it will be a better choice than the alternative for that individual consumer. It will produce positive impact on the land. It will send demand signals, which will allow this category and the tide that you referenced to continue to grow. It will support a tide that lifts others. And again, if we go back and look at the acceleration of demand for these types of products, I think let's
look at that. Actually, this might be a good moment to take a peek at that.
Yeah, actually, let me say one thing and then do that. I would say, going back to the are we competitors, I think in depending on its semantics, we can, in one way you can define it as a yes, and another way I tend to say no, that we're allies. I think we're fighting for the same things. Here's the thing. You have stated just moments ago that you appreciate what we're doing and value our success. And I feel the same way with you. And I think that we agree that it's not a zero-sum game and our progress benefits one another. To me, that's allies. I am a competitor with Tyson or Cargill. And you are too,
Yes.
Or commodity.
And we are together
nameless.
A competitor with Tyson and Cargill.
Right.
Like it is us holding hands, I think, that actually creates the stronger competitor against Tyson and Cargill. And I think that so much of what we're talking about is how you build an alternative to this corporate organism, to some of these massive corporations that do not have people, planet at their heart. And I agree with you. We are allies. And I really appreciate that, actually, because I think it is very true.
And it's a fine line in this world, and so it has to be a continued pursuit and focus. And I want to get better and better at it. But again, going back to looking at the case study of organic and its journey as a benchmark for comparison to talk about the rising tide. If you go back to the 60s or 70s, organic by and large didn't really exist. It started to truly accelerate in the 80s and 90s, and in the 90s, I think it was a few $1 billion organic. Today, it's like almost $60 billion and 5% of U.S. food sales, and something like 80% of households buy an organic item and knowingly pay a premium consciously, namely they pay that premium because they think it produces a better impact on the environment and because they think it produces a better impact on their health. Health is the primary factor. All promises that regenerative also makes and over delivers on relative to organic. But organic went from non-existent to 5% of the food supply and 80% and something and 80%
at
households.
60 billion. At 60 billion, it is still only 5%. And I do want to draw attention to just how wild that is.
Yeah, in an $850 billion food industry. Yeah. But so organic grew from next to nothing to 60 billion. It was on, over the course of a couple of decades, it grew at 10% a year. And that's had a profound impact on how consumers choose to buy food and how organizations brand themselves. Look at all the fast food restaurants painting themselves, earthy tone greens and browns, and like they're trying to appear organic as in response to this consumer revolution. And the cool thing is, regenerative is there where organic was in its origin. It's at a little over $1 billion global market, $300 million in the US. But it's, I've been working in regenerative food systems for over a decade, and what's cool
you and me
is that
both.
while organic grew at 10% a year, regenerative is growing at over almost 16% a year. It's like, over 50% faster. And, they estimate that regenerative will be, over a $10 billion market by in sometime in the 2030s. So that's super, super encouraging. Like that is that larger pie that we all benefit from. And we look to whether it's branded or unbranded, grass-fed or regenerative, producers or brands, they're by and large mostly growing. The successful ones are the household name ones, the ones you're more commonly familiar with. I think farmers and ranchers are struggling at large, but I think we are seeing there being a number of operations that are taking advantage of that growth and demand and benefiting from it. And so those are the same people that you and I would say are both competitors and allies. And I think this movement, this momentum, this awareness, this consumer revolution, all of these things give me confidence that I'm on the right side of the equation, that our efforts at Force of Nature are generating, despite some trade-offs, a net positive benefit towards both domestic and international, food production and demand, and really, I think that we're so close. I think through our supply chains across all of our proteins, we're currently impacting 1.9 something million acres.
You're almost at 2.
Yeah, it's huge. It's.
I saw your Christmas card.
Yeah, you already see it. You already see it. I just got my package.
No, Morgan posted it on Instagram, so you
cool.
can blame Morgan because he started some patio fires that made it onto there.
Yeah. The majority of that is here in the U.S., but it's cool. I mean, you read our mission statement. Global issues. So.
I want to touch on that, but before I want to highlight 2 things that I think happen when we see this massive expansion of something like organic, and then to see regenerative following in its footsteps at a rate of 16% per year, where organic was really sitting at about 10%. And you taught me what a compounded annual growth rate was earlier. A CAGR, is that what you called it?
Yeah.
A CAGR. I think that this does a couple of really important things. And I think number one is this makes nutrient-dense whole foods very accessible to the consumer. And this is of vital importance to me, that people are able to access food that is nourishing to their bodies. And that means having it at the supermarket. And I truly mean that. And it also makes nutrient-dense whole foods accessible to the soil, right? That we are seeing a wider distribution of it, that we are seeing a company like Force of Nature that has almost 2 million acres under regenerative management and is actively investing in helping companies either transition or build into those regenerative spaces that can create more economic feasibility within those companies. And this is something I've thought a lot about with Western Daughters, is how can we pay farmers and ranchers a wage that helps them also create a sustainable business, which has been historically quite difficult, and create those partnerships on a, both domestic and a global level. And to bring us back to where we were, our mission is to accelerate the creation of a global regenerative supply network. And to create sustainable businesses across a wide array of spaces, and to create more soil organic matter. Again, we're losing 2 billion tons of topsoil in the US per year. That says nothing for other places. And to create this network of allies the world over, where we really are beginning to take a tangible slice out of those corporate food entities that are right now, driving driving consumer health, driving land health. And so I think that there's a niche here for everyone, and there's a niche here everywhere.
I believe that. I agree.
You agree? Do you want to talk a little bit about that? About what it means to build a supply network? And you and I have spent a lot of time talking about this, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about what it means to be for lack of a better term, an aggregator at Western Daughters, right? Like we aggregate, we pull from different farms and ranches to create to create some different sources of meat for our consumers, and to create some feasibility across the supply chain also for Western Daughters, in order of when things are slaughtered and when we need certain items. And so we are really trying to build something that flows both ways, where we're able to pay farmers and ranchers, we're able to invest back into communities, and we're also able to create a sustainable business, both from a profit standpoint and a people standpoint and a planet standpoint. I like that three-legged stool.
I can't take credit for almost anything I say. All these are concepts that I've learned elsewhere. But I think to your point on trying to do it at all scales, I think for me and for us, we want producers to have the opportunity, but not the obligation, to work a farmer's market, have their own brand, to sell direct to consumer online, to sell into retail, to do any number of things. I think the struggle has become so great that many of those things have been pursued out of desperation. And those are really, really difficult and distracting things to do if you want to be a rancher. And you actually want to not deal with humans, and you just want to be
correct
in relation to your land and your animals and stewarding them. And you take that call primary to all else, but you can't do that unless you work an 8th day of the week, or 169th hour in the week, and or do these other things that add complication and distraction to your core. Like that's a system that's failing farmers and ranchers, which is why farmers and ranchers are suffering depression and suicide and failing, and generations aren't coming back, and there's a general sense of hopelessness from these communities, which is why they're in such decline. And so, like, I want to create incentives for them to be able to do whatever the heck they want to stay on their farm, to live their legacy and their goals and their values so they see. And if that means I am sourcing from a person or an operation or a family who has a brand that sells online and in retail, and who, as to our prior conversation, I would quote unquote compete with, but I source from them, I think there's a collaboration. There's an ally relationship there. And I was just having a call with a rancher out of Oklahoma the other day at our annual planning call, and our supply from him is going to grow 10 times year over year what it was. Wow. And we were like, man, this is a cool story. Do you mind if we tell your story? And he's like, nope, I don't want you telling my story. I don't want anybody coming out here. I don't want to talk to anybody. I don't want to see anybody. He's just like, not like he's anything to hide. He's just like, that sounds like a bunch of modern nonsense. I'm just trying to raise some cattle here, guys. Like, I appreciate you. And I like my world the way it is. And so it's cool. We're able to help him do that. And then we have other people that, we work with that, I think many that you and many others that probably listen to this show are aware of and have bought from in the past. So I think, that's an example of how I think of, like, hey, we're playing a role. They sell us what they want to sell us for a price that they think supports them and that we can agree on. And sometimes we want things that they won't sell us, or they cap and they won't tell us more, and whatever. It's like, look, it's great. Like, I'm going to try to be a part of the puzzle for you, and we'll find a way to work together. And I think this is interesting. There was Bonterra Partners did a report, I don't know when, but it cites the 4 basic topics that need to be addressed for domestic grass-fed industry to realize its potential. And the 4 are year-round production and availability of high-quality grass-finished products, stronger labeling standards and national brand building efforts, improved supply chain, and lower cost of finished products. That's 4. I'll give a different kind of. And so, I think force of nature is helping to facilitate all 4 of those things in a variety of ways, none of them perfectly. But I think it's the combination of those things that, again, supports the advancement of the domestic grass-fed beef industry. I think having good products year round, I think promoting and creating transparency, I think creating a supply chain that can level the playing field and costs. Because again, the commodity industrial supply chain is incentivized through subsidized, thank you, through federal dollars, and is so hyper efficient as to being brittle and lacking resiliency. But that supply chain is well established compared to the grass-fed supply chain. It's not. Like, that's why we say we're creating a supply network at a global scale. And then, lowering cost of finished product, right? Like, consumers don't really have, generally speaking, awareness of these issues, let alone access. So the access part, I think we're helping with. We're introducing more people into the conversation and helping find ways to get products to them at costs that bring them into the journey. And hopefully, then they're in the pool of consumers that we share, or work with, or, they go down their own path and they influence others. And so I think those are interesting. I think that's interesting on this topic, at least, that, how we can see different ways of supporting each of those pillars and advancing the industry domestically.
I wrote those down because we've worked in grass-fed meat for the last 10 years over that. And, when we started, I spent some time cold calling ranchers and telling them what we needed. And I got laughed off the phone quite a few times. So this is 11, 12 years ago. So what year is it? This is like 2011. And I got laughed off the phone when I told people that I wanted a year-round supply of grass-fed beef, because at the time it was really only being processed in the fall, which is traditional for a lot of reasons. And, at Western Daughters, what we ended up doing was building this sort of year-round supply chain. And I think, again, we're talking about going up against a system that, while brittle, is hyper efficient, and has created these supply networks that really go deep. And I think that there is this element of working to better build domestic grass-fed beef at a scale that is able to be sustainable as a business model, right? And again, this is really critical. And maybe I should just ask this question outright: does this mean that you have to take some grass-fed beef from a global supply network?
I think so. I think in a journey and in a path to go from where we are to where we want to be, I think there's a whole lot of things that are necessary and appropriate. Again, it is a diversity of solutions, and I think there's so much complexity involved in what the heck is international supply in beef. I was reading an article from the Texas and Southwest Cattle Ranchers Association that was talking about how imports help producers, and setting the stage for balanced exchange and make sure the things that are the United States is the number one consumer of beef per capita in the world. We produce a heck of a lot of it as well. But from a demand perspective, about almost 50% of what we eat is ground meat, mostly hamburgers. And the overwhelming majority of the cattle we produce is really fatty cattle. And so we have to export certain parts of the animal and import other parts of the animal to lean up our ground mix. And so the health of that exchange depends on, a fair system of give and take that, we can Americans don't want to eat the heart and the liver or the organs generally. Well, our customers do. We don't
yeah, our
get rid of any of
customers
those,
do
but
too.
historically at a macro level, there are a lot of parts of the animal that don't really have a market here that do have a market on the international. So we export those, and then we import things that we can't produce domestically enough of, such that it can create a product that consumers actually desire when blended when blended together. And so I just think like, and is that absolute? Well, there's nuance to it, and like none of this stuff is cut and dry. But I do think, going back to my prior point as well. Oh, and by the way, some of those exports create value on the carcass that wouldn't exist. Again, like we don't have the market here, so we either dispose of it or sell it to rendering, or we find a viable market for it in an international market. But I think, I think this just goes back to the idea that we have to be open to supporting systems at global scales to address global challenges. I think the US is like 30% of the global demand. It's like the consumer market of the world, 30% resides in the United States. So much of, or most of, what we consume is coming from other places. I think 50% of our vegetables and produce are coming from other places. And it's like, well, then stop eating bananas if you don't like that. Don't eat avocados, don't eat tomatoes. The majority of these cuts specifically, most of our trade is coming from the US and Canada. So it kind of goes back to my question earlier. Is it the zip code, the county, the region, the state, the country, the continent? Where do these lines fall? You talked a moment ago about aggregation. I don't know anybody, that is a commonly known family farm with a brand selling into retail or online that is a closed loop system. All of them are aggregating. There's nothing wrong with that. They are leveraging their strength and their abilities and their capacity to tell a story and reach a consumer to support people in their community. That's fine. That's okay. Like it doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be better, and it has to continue to push itself to raise the bar and try and improve. And I feel like that's the struggle that we face, is like, letting there's two extremes. It's like, let perfection be the enemy of progress, and don't and then take the false step of standing still, or say any effort is representative of progress, so make compromises that you shouldn't make. It's a difficult exchange to balance, but I'll pause there, because this is a topic it's hard to wrangle.
It is a really hard to wrangle topic. And I think that part of it, and part of the reason that I began this conversation in talking a little bit about how difficult it is to run a business, and the importance of regenerative and sustainable businesses, is because I think that this is actually a side of the business that, as consumers, you don't have as much transparency or as much knowledge or as much story centered around, because it's not necessarily, and let's call a spade a spade. It's really sexy to get out there and to talk about what a bison is doing while it's managed in this holistic and regenerative way, and it's building soil, and it's bringing all of this biodiversity back. And it's not as fun to talk about what it means to run a meat business on the business side, whether you are a farmer or an aggregator, which Western Daughters is also an aggregator, and in a bit of a different but also the same sort of way. But it's really important to understand that when you look at Cargill, which has generated, I think, more billionaires in a single family than any company on earth. I think there's 14 of them, and has a fascinating role in the rise of the commodities market. Or you look at JBS Swift, or you look at Tyson, or you look at Purdue, which are the businesses that we are going up against, that force of nature and Western Daughters and various farmers and ranchers across not just the United States, but the globe are serving as allies to begin to create an alternative to that system, that those business models are really hard because you've got a couple of different things going on. And correct me if I'm wrong here, or if you have a different insight, but you've touched on many of them. Number one, and Force of Nature does this better than anyone I know. It's part of how we ended up getting linked up because I respected it so much. You got to move a whole hell of a lot of ground meat. There is more ground meat, more of what Western Daughters calls trim on an animal than the majority of small farmers and ranchers can move outside of share programs, because there is a big driver for those higher on the hog steaks that are, ribeyes, New York strips. That's one of the biggest issues that Western Daughters has had is finding enough avenues for ground meat to have whole animal utilization, where we are purchasing full whole animals. And so that's one really big hiccup. You're also working with a whole food perishable product, where you get into what it means to mark up a pill or a powder or a supplement. When you're looking at, multiple times markup, you have a much smaller margin on whole foods, and especially whole foods that are in essence perishable. Whether they are frozen or fresh is a little bit less of part of the issue. And then you also have these complex relationships where everybody's margins within these supply chains are incredibly tight. And what Cargill and Tyson have is volume on their side. And I know that one of the biggest hiccups to being sustainable, which we could also just call profitable for Western Daughters, has been that we can't quite reach a volume that helps make sense of our labor and other external costs outside of our cost of goods sold, which is protein. And this has resulted in, we pay our farmers and ranchers well, but there isn't quite enough for us to continue to do business. And so you're up against some pretty big hurdles on the backside. And I think it's really important that we at least try to tell these stories to consumers, but they're definitely not as sexy as talking about how awesome bison are as a keystone species.
Yeah. Yeah. And I appreciate the acknowledgement there. You brought that up a number of times on the trim piece, but I thought that was the reason we did that. May be obvious to some, but as we get into our own whole animal programs, we knew that's the challenge. Overcoming moving the trim, which is majority of the carcass, would be tough. So that's where we started by design to try to solve our biggest problem first. We also knew that because it's tough, it's the biggest challenge that many producers face. And I can remember somebody that's a friend that's a producer that has a retail brand and an online brand, and having an initial conversation with them and then telling me that they're struggling with trim, and they got some it's an anchor on their business and a freezer aging, and they're pretty concerned about it. And I sent 2 semi trucks and took all of their debt, all of their liability, all their anchor off of their business for them. It was the first order we made of them. And it feels good. That's an example of a win.
Yeah.
That's what makes me excited about what we do. Sometimes it doesn't work out. Sometimes we aren't able to support, but over our partners, or they decide to go a different direction. And, that's unfortunate, but that's the exception. We're net growing and supporting, and I've worked with many folks for a long, long time. And yeah, I think, again, it's just trying to balance all of those dynamics and do right by as many people as you can simultaneously, and try to have a vision for the future and try to juggle all of these different complex interrelationships and land each step, trying to net in a positive triple bottom line, ethical, high integrity new place relative to where you were before, and that you can feel really good about. And I take that at all scales. I think that I know I feel uncomfortable because I don't want to name that person, although I'd love to give them credit because they deserve support. I've named them in other podcasts, but I feel really good when I go to somebody's home and I sit down with them and I tell them that working with us, I want it to be a benefit to them near and long term. However, it's at their discretion. But I want to be there for them how they need and to do that. And I feel the same way, talking to a rancher from Australia, like they're still humans. They're still struggling. The majority of what, some of these folks in international markets produce goes to the US. Like that's how they live. That is their livelihood. And they're an agriculturalist. They are a rancher. They are struggling in the same way and experiencing the same human realities and the same market realities. And there's,
and the same brittle landscape realities.
The same realities. And we did our annual supplier call with our first ever international partner in Australia. And like the way that we set up that relationship was a big, you and I talked about it up in April. We hadn't done it yet. We brought on a partner mid-year this year to support a burger launch of beef into Hop Dotty. And it's like a big step, like if I felt like the only and easiest path was to work with international supply chains day one, that's how we would have started, but we didn't. We started domestic supply chains and domestic producers and a domestic network, and then found an opportunity to work with a very large food service burger chain, Hop Dotty, who said, hey, look, like,
thank you for defining that for people who might not know.
We really believe in what y'all are doing in regenerative, and we're buying a more commodity centric product, and we would love to supply our customer. We did a survey, and our customers thought the bison we were selling them was grass fed. They don't realize most bison aren't grass fed, so we're going to switch to your bison because they're regenerative and grass fed. And while we're telling this regenerative story, and while our consumers are gravitating towards it and showing appreciation for it, we want to start to shift some of our beef supply over, and we have burger restaurants that have dozens of locations move a lot of ground meat, but they need it on a weekly basis.
Could you actually reveal any of those numbers? Do you have any of them? And would it be okay for you to say them? Because we've been talking a lot about numbers, and I'd be curious to get a grip on that.
I don't know if it's my place, but I would say millions of pounds. Multiples of millions of pounds that they have a potential to impact. And so when somebody at that scale comes and says, hey, like, we want to leverage our scale and our willingness to pay a premium to create a regenerative product. And then and then when we do it, we want to tell a story. We want to put hundreds of thousands of dollars into promoting this mission and introducing people to this concept. That's
that education piece.
Exactly core to our mission. But, it's a big step for us to go, to figure out how to scale at that level. I mean, that's not like something that we can just turn on instantaneously. So I think we looked all over the US, couldn't figure out how to do it. Again, the supply network didn't exist. It has to be consistent in quality, consistent in timing on a weekly basis, fresh. And all of those things have to work out in such a way that the dots connect, because price does matter. They're, in this particular instance, they were willing to pay that 70% premium that we're talking about, a huge premium, but there was a limit to what they can do. So there's a step. It's like, it's like either this opportunity exists and these consumers get introduced to regenerative, and the mission and the message is amplified and grass fed, or it doesn't. And started looking in the US, looked in South America, looked in Australia, ended up partnering with the local savory hub in Australia. I actually, in conjunction with this, hired a guy named Walker. He's a savory master verifier. Sent him to Australia to baseline a 250,000 acre ranch that had historically been conventional. That actually created that supply and all that momentum and all that inertia for this movement. We're now at they did this in anticipation. We're now 1 year in and baselining, and they're training all of their ranchers across all of their network, which is a very big network and land base, something to the tune of 16 million acres. They're all training and reach with a local resource conservation service that has tenets of regenerative. So those influences, it may not be our supply chain, but that reverberation, that ripple effect, that influence is changing how they practice as a whole, because they're looking at a challenging year on their land base and seeing that they can actually sustain more animals, and they're having more biomass or growth or greenery and more diversity, and
More
understanding,
resiliency.
some of the challenges that the others in their community that aren't practicing these principles are seeing. At that scale, they're saying, hey, this can benefit us at large. And so, and then you sit down and, like at our conference last year, the What Good Shall I Do conference, talking to a venison farmer from New Zealand, and talking about the deer industry there and the challenge there, and seeing the struggle on their face. And I'm like, man, nobody's going to convince me that working with this guy is a bad thing. Like, they fucking need it. So I get really excited about the opportunity to do this stuff. And then to the point about bringing on that Australian Australian partner for that, for Hop Dotty. I'm proud as hell about that. I'm proud as hell about that story. I can't wait to do more of it. It still only equates to 8% of our supply. It's not like,
yeah.
It's changed the face of the company or the nature of the business. But it's like, to your point about, hey, when or can or will force of nature ever be able to influence part of the structure, part of the system at a policy or at a governmental level? Like, I'm proud that we're at a point where we can start to live and fulfill the mission that we set from day one 5 years ago, to facilitate the creation of global regenerative supply networks and addressing global crises at a global scale. I think it's really cool, and I think it's really exciting. It's really challenging. It's full of trade-offs, but I think the way that we're going about it's the right way, and I know a lot of folks disagree and a lot of folks agree. Now I'll pause there and say one thing. There's one thing that I find really atrocious on the concept of country of origin labeling, and that's, if somebody was to, like, we did this, it didn't go into our bricks, it went into a food service supply chain. Not to mention, we never even, like, all of our beef has always been U.S. sourced, but we never put product USA on there. That's not a thing that we're founded on. We're founded on regenerative principles and regenerative supply network at a global scale. We even have legacy goals that are to convert 1 billion acres, and which is more acreage of agriculture than exists in the United States. But I think the idea that these international markets will mislead or deceive consumers that are specifically looking for products of the USA, and if something is labeled, something came from a foreign place, and somebody puts a product of the USA label on that item, to me, that's like not just deceitful or disingenuous. I think that's criminal. It's like akin to stolen valor, right? Like, you're making a claim that is false. I think that's totally wrong, and I support anybody that is opposed to that. What I don't agree with is the idea that anything sourced from an international supply chain should bear a scarlet letter. Should be that those farmers doing the right thing, creating a good product that's benefiting the American market and the American consumer, should be punitively treated or penalized, especially when they're creating solutions and opportunities and doing what we all would consider generally creation of goodwill in a world that relies on global supply chains and global supply markets, and we're all interrelated. And so I think I probably went off on a little bit of a tangent there, but I think that nuance matters, and I think people should understand where we're coming from and why we're doing those things, and why we're proud of it, and why we're excited to continue to do more of it.
I think that nuance matters, absolutely. And I think that something else matters is you just told 2 stories about 2 different producers in New Zealand. And there's some pretty big hiccups, as far as I know, in producing game here in the United States. So when we're talking about venison, we're talking about elk or anything like that, but venison market especially. There's some really big hurdles to producing game in the United States. And I don't know of anybody who's really doing it at any imaginable scale. You told 2 really beautiful stories about relationships that you built, and also about transparency. And I think that one of the things that you and I have been talking about this entire time is what it means to be pretty transparent companies, right? To give people a peek at at the struggles of the business, in a kind of behind the scenes way. I think that there has been a lot of discussion about the struggles that farmers go through, and what it means to build relationships that are building resilient networks, both local and global, both very small businesses and businesses that are on a different growth trajectory, a bigger growth trajectory, like Force of Nature, and how this is creating a resilient alternative to a system that, I think before this sort of epic rise of organic that we just talked about felt like it was a foregone conclusion. And we are really creating an alternative in building this together across all boundaries. And I agree with you that it should not bear a scarlet letter, and that when you have transparent practices and you have companies like Force of Nature that has a very transparent mission statement with some big goals. I mean, 1 billion acres, right? That was one of the. Am I right?
Yeah, well, it was
Is that what you said? 1 billion
yeah,
acres?
1 billion. Yeah. Well, like our legacy goals, at Epic, one of them was, see the conversion of 1 million acres from conventional to regenerative. And, we were able to accomplish that in a variety of ways. And so when we said, like, what's the pie in the sky goal for Force of Nature? Why are we even creating this company? It's like, our agriculture system needs to change, not our plant-based agriculture system, not our animal-based agriculture system, our agriculture system, our system of producing food using biology, plants, animals, and leveraging ecosystems and their bounty and abundance. That system is broken. It's failing. It's desperately in need of repair, and that's the goal of the company. So let's create some pretty audacious, moonshot type goals. So, yeah, directly, indirectly, support and influence the conversion of 1 billion acres of agriculture from conventional to regenerative. Well, it turns out there's about 11 billion acres of agriculture on the planet. So basically, what that goal implies is to see regenerative become 10% of the food supply. That's way bigger than Force of Nature, but we get to there. That's change. Another goal is to see regenerative be a household name in the same vein that organic is. Most consumers are buying organic or are aware of organic, and now organic.
I have this stat. Do you want this? Do you want the actual statistic?
It's 83%, right?
Familiar with the term organic?
I have 59%. The Salon survey. There's a bunch of different statistics out there. I don't think that one really applies to the point I'm making here, but we can get into the statistics if you want in a sec. But like I quoted a bit ago, 83% of households are buying and willing to pay a premium for an organic item. Man, when regenerative gets there, that's great. We know organic's 5% of the market. Well, golly, how awesome would it be to see regenerative get there? Again, these goals aren't about Force of Nature. They're about this mission and this movement. And the last goal is about Force of Nature, but you could put an asterisk on it. To see Force of Nature achieve a scale of 1% of the U.S. The meat market. I think that's it's my favorite goal, probably because I'm a finance guy and a numbers guy, and maybe this is the right podcast to say that. But 1% of the U.S. meat market, I love it because it's a tiny number. Like most unknowing peoples would look at that and say, what an insignificant aspiration, 1%. But the U.S. meat market's real big. It's over $100 billion, and so that's a pretty big revenue number. But also, like, I think it says a lot in what it doesn't say. I don't want, and we don't need to centralize a system around us. I don't need to be the cornerstone of the market. I want to be successful and to demonstrate the potential of a sustainable path in regenerative. And I want to have a positive ripple effect or a rising tide effect, like you noted earlier, that benefits all other allies and good actors in the space. So if Force of Nature was to achieve that third goal, it almost implies the other two are being advanced, and it implies fundamentally that Western daughters and the other folks that we work with domestically and internationally are all benefiting. And these global crises that we're facing and seeking to address in the food system that's failing is finally seeing a scale of impact and change worthy of celebration.
Mm-hmm. And that's the question that always gets asked, right? Is like, is this scalable? And I think that you're putting the proof in the pudding.
We're trying. I think we got a Where Hope Grows podcast coming out on that maybe here in a week or so. Can you
about putting the proof in the pudding?
No, can you feed a growing population? And then there's some provocative side conversations in there as well.
Oh, I can't wait for that one. We'll throw that in the show notes too. We're sitting at 2 hours. How are you feeling?
I feel good. I feel like we've covered a lot of stuff. I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, we could always keep going.
Any big pieces? Any big pieces you feel like we haven't hit, before and this doesn't have to be in the recording, but any big pieces that you want to hit before we begin to wrap up?
No, I it feels like it was a very, to your point about the arc, felt like we covered most of the key things in a very natural, authentic way. And I don't, I'm sure you and I are perfectionists and could always tweak, and I'm sure you're like me, or like after the fact, you're going to have a million thoughts. But I think that this was like we said, we wanted to have a different conversation and get a little weird and talk about some hard stuff. I feel pretty good about the way we've covered it.
I do too. I feel really good about it. And I actually think it might be interesting to talk a little bit about animals existing in reality just for a second here. And I want to say why, because I think that we have talked so much about the increasing unreality that us as a human animal is existing in, right? That, we began this conversation really talking about this sort of overlay, this interaction, this Venn diagram between quantitative and qualitative, between what is the natural world, the way that bison would have roamed the plains under the influence of predation, and the built world, and some of the realities of that built world that there are now fences. That cannot happen in any situation in the foreseeable future once again. And so, we're talking about sort of these overlays and these complex interactions between the quantitative and the qualitative, between the built world and the natural world. And you and I had a conversation. You brought up a point I love, that when you're spending time with, for me, it's goats. I think for you, it's a little bit more bison. These animals live deep within reality. You want to kind of take it from there?
Yeah, I think, there's so much to touch on there. And I think it ties to so much else that we've talked about. But, I think animals, generally speaking, in wild or in pastoral systems, exist in their natural state in a much better fashion than we do. They're not wearing clothes, and they're not trying to figure out how to distance themselves from the evolutionary realities and behaviors and biological desires that they have. They're content in it. And it's like we have an aversion to acknowledging that we exist in biology and are part of nature and are animals in and of ourselves. And I think some of that must come from, our desire to avoid acknowledging, our own death, and this, and if in nature, which we love and it is beautiful, that is where the circle of life exists. That is where death begets life, where life, death, decay, new life, it takes life to sustain life. And we can appreciate the balance and harmony of that as long as we don't have to acknowledge our role in it. And then we've begun to, create our own matrix or our own synthetic environment And I think many people today believe that there's like the human world and then there's nature, and these are separate things fundamentally and practically. And I think you look at, what our ancestors, the lives they would have lived, how they would have lived, how much time they would have spent in a parasympathetic state versus a sympathetic state, meaning, running the rat race, stressed, high anxiety, high heart rate, high blood pressure, versus like hanging out, sitting on a log, sitting on a rock, watching the sun, or watching ripples on a pond.
Yep.
And you look at, the synthetic things we've introduced into our, it always, there's these funny contradictions, these funny irony. I don't know how better to describe them than, that we try to create a bubble and distance ourselves. And then within our bubble, we try to replicate the very things that we're distancing ourselves from. So it's like, okay, let me slave away in front of a computer so I can get PTO so that I can go spend time in nature. Or, hey, obviously symptoms of this, urban synthetic life are causing all this stress and depression and anxiety. So let me make sure I schedule on my calendar a 15-minute time block to meditate. Or, hey, I'm not out in a natural environment, using my body in a natural way and struggling and trialing. So let me go to a gym and lift synthetic weights. Like, these are all, and I do these things. I live, I'm not saying I'm
I do some of these things too. Absolutely.
But it's interesting when you look at it, and yet animals are just there, doing their thing on a daily basis, living their life, playing their role and exhibiting their potential to the extent we allow them. I think it's really cool. I think we live in this sad. I think Americans particularly live in this sad place.
We live in captivity.
Well, I think we live in captivity of our own making. I would consider densely populated cities akin to human CAFOs. And I think we, prioritize productivity and efficiency and all these things where we end up trying to squeeze every moment out of life, and it leads to squeezing the life out of every moment. And
yep.
Well,
that's heavy. Yeah, I agree.
And then we're encouraged to do it and all those things. So, I just think there's a lot of lessons that we've really touched on, and this kind of applies to about, who are we? What's our role? Why do we do the things we do? And how do we truck on? It's funny. I was listening to a Sean Baker. He's a carnivore guy, but I was listening to a podcast he did with some vegans, and these vegans were telling him, they were talking about the ethical aspect of eating meat. He's like, oh, you're killing animals when you eat. He's like, well, vegans kill a lot of animals. He's like, well, those don't count. I actually think the natural world should be eliminated because there's so many rights violations occurring in the natural world where when one animal preys on another animal, it's a rights violation. So we should exterminate all animals. And I'm like, how do we get down a path where somebody can develop a philosophy where that makes any sense whatsoever? And I just think it comes from a distancing of ourselves from our own reality, our own origins, our own purpose, our own potential, and our place in a system that includes food, but includes, every other aspect of an ecosystem that we're a part of. And we have this unique capacity to recognize that and be empathetic towards it and to make conscious and intentional changes to improve, where we are in the future relative to where we are today. And like I said, I think we've got some pretty big challenges out there, and we veered pretty far astray from the path I think we would want to be on. It's threatening to our future and our potential here, but the same scale and the same degree to which we've, veered from the path, we have the exact same potential to not just return, but even improve beyond where we began. So touch on
I think it's coming back to that touches on it beautifully, and the to bring it back, like, and this has been and will be a part of the conversation that's happening a lot on this podcast, is what it is to be the human animal. And somebody said the other day on here that we have a great capacity for affiliative and generative love, beyond our species and within our species. And I think that when we harness that capability to become part of this interconnected web of life, that I think in and of itself is a hyper object, right? There are 1 billion microorganisms in a single teaspoon of soil. I don't know how many teaspoons are in a ton, but when we lose that topsoil every year, that might be some fun back of the napkin math for us to do another time. How many organisms are we losing? And we as humans, when we step into a sense of purpose, of affiliative connection within the web of life and stewardship of that, while simultaneously building these relationships above ground between other humans that help to lift us and to create allies, to create systems that bring more resiliency and a generative and generous nature to the web of life within the food system and also without it. I think that we are stepping into some of the best aspects of what it means to be human. And the idea that through that affiliative nature, through that sense of purpose, through that force of nature, that we would regenerate 1 billion, have 1 billion acres under regenerative management in one way or another. Like, oh, that's a big deal. And I also think that that is some of the best of what it means to be this human animal.
Yeah. Oh, I think that's really well said. We've clearly detached ourselves from that natural reality, and also we clearly still yearn for it. So I hope
Yes.
on this journey we can rekindle some of those connections and return to our origins in the ways that um, allow us to do everything that you just beautifully laid out.
Yeah. Well, I think you guys are doing an incredible job. And I think that what I've gotten to see, we didn't touch on agriculture versus agribusiness, though it was certainly in there, that you are creating a culture that isn't just company wide, that I think that flows out to other members of your communities. I mean, across the world. And I've been lucky enough to be a part of that culture over the past year, and to see firsthand the perspective and the viewpoint and the business and the care and the presence with which you are considering some incredibly complex topics across the food system and even beyond it. And so I think that you are putting a lot of that culture and putting a lot of that back into um, the idea of building a regenerative business.
Well, I can't. I appreciate that, and I can't take credit for it. We obviously have a great team, and I think that's the other cool
Oh,
and fun thing that you've been able to do is, unlike some people, you've gotten to meet almost every single person on our team, and
hmm,
I think I don't want to speak for you, but from my perspective, at least, I think every one of them embodies that same spirit and champions that um, you know that same desire and intention. I think even if I were to fall, even if I were to have a blind spot and do something off the path, they wouldn't allow for it. Like they are going to, like, our own culture as a business is going to help um,
yes.
us stay the course. And I think that we put a lot of intention and I have a lot of confidence in the people that are on our team that they're here for the right reasons, and that's what gives us that is our superpower. That's what allows us to do all the things we do. The incredible people that work with us.
Yeah, and when I was talking about culture, that's what I was talking about. I was talking about Emily and Marshall and Morgan and all the individuals that I have gotten the chance to meet over the last year that truly do embody that and add to it and create a texture and a story to your company. Okay. Well, where can people find you? Where should we wrap it up? Should we call it?
But sure. You can. I've already told you that you should buy from should harvest your own animals, or you should buy from Western Daughters. But if you are in some place and you are looking or come across Force of Nature, or available a heck of a lot of grocery stores out there, and you can find us online at forceofnature.com, or like I said, Hop Dottie or True Foods Kitchen, or some really other well-intentioned and thoughtful restaurants out there that we work with. And I think, again, don't buy something from us, but follow us at Force of Nature Meats on Instagram. Go to our website, look to our blogs, get connected to your food, return to your human potential and reality, and just learn about these systems, and start to make decisions that more align with your values once you're exposed to a little more of the truth out there. And I hope that we can help you find a path towards what you're looking for, and whether that's just in engaging in the conversations with us or supporting us as a customer, that's up to you. But I'm grateful for you, Kate, and for all the good people out there trying to do their best and serving this mission as well.
Oh, I'm super grateful for getting to know y'all over the last year, and just for the work that you're doing in this space. And thank you for coming on and having this sort of wild and rollicking conversation, and all the prep that went into it too. So I just really have enjoyed getting to know you over the last year. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, the pleasure's mine. Feelings mutual for sure.
Okay. We did. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Mind, Body, and Soil podcast. If what you found resonated with you, may I ask that you share it with your friends, or leave us a rating and review wherever you listen to podcasts? This act of reciprocity helps others find Mind, Body, and Soil. If you're looking for more, you can find us at groundworkcollective.com and at Kate_Kavanaugh, that's KATE_KAVANAUGH on Instagram. I would like to give a very special thank you to China and Seth Kent of the band All Right, All Right for the clips from their beautiful song Over the Edge from their album The Crucible. You can find them at All Right, All Right on Instagram and wherever you listen to music.